boldly engaging the mindless propaganda of our time, apparently with reason. This is Rage of the Age.
This is Rage of the Age, and we have with us today the assistant editor for the Mises Wire. He's the former deputy communications director for the House Financial Services Committee. He's written articles in the Federalist, the Daily Caller, and the Business Insider. He is also the author of the recently released book, Anatomy of the Crash, Financial Crisis of 2020. I want to introduce to you Tho Bishop. Tho, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me on. Excited to join you.
Now, I came across this term recently called Austrian economics.
Yes.
And I've never, ever heard of that term Austrian economics. So I dived into it a little bit, trying to understand. I'm like, is this a new thing? You know, some new fad of economics? But apparently this is, got some age behind it. This is pre-John Smith, I understand, concepts of economics. Why don't you go ahead and start there? Give me and others listening an overview of what Austrian economics is.
Well, the term Austrian, especially for an American audience, can make it seem very exotic and foreign, but it's kind of interesting. The name was actually originally meant to be an insult because the original. Yes, this is great. So the name comes from the fact that the kind of pioneers in this particular methodology and kind of view on what economic science really is taught at the University of Vienna. And within the German-speaking world, Austria was kind of seen like the backwater. And so you had a lot of powerful economists that rejected the Austrians, kind of dismissing it as the Austrian school in the same way that, say, like a New York Times reporter would dismiss something as like the Alabama School of Economics, right?
Right.
It's not meant to, like it was meant to like, oh, like those crazy,
right.
Rednecks essentially of Germany over there saying this. But what it really is that it is a view of economics that is very logical based rather than mathematical. So we look at the limitations of what kind of these modeling methods that are out there and very prominent today could show. Basically, we understand that economics at the end of the day is not about money. It's not about modeling. It's not about these larger scale things. It is about human action. It is about how individuals decide to use finite resources, including what we have in the environment, our time, all this sort of things. We all have our individual subjective wants and desires. Value itself comes from that subjective value. So again, if someone has a guitar, right, that guitar in the hands of someone that's very skilled has a lot of value. That guitar in my hands has no value at all.
That's right.
And so there's all these sort of things that it's very individualistic, the way that these properties really portray themselves out within society as a whole. And then when you build from that individual methodology, you start getting into things where you understand the limitations of central planning. One of the big kind of highlights of the Austrian school came during when the rise of socialism was happening in Europe. Economists named von Bavark and Louis von Mises, who was a student, were big opponents of Karl Marx and the rise of socialism. And Mises in particular, he made this completely a devastating critique of socialism, kind of getting to the point where, like, if you have communal property and nobody has property rights, everything's kind of decided by whatever the central plan is.
Right.
Then you don't have prices, right? Because they're deciding what the end goals are. There's no prices in that system. If you have no prices, you have no way of understanding how something like steel or metal or iron, which has multiple uses, right? You don't know exactly how to figure out what is the best use for that over time.
Yes.
And so it just shows like central planning doesn't work, which I think historically has been rather well vindicated between the Soviet Union, between Venezuela and other places. And then in kind of its current form now, the reason Austrian economics, the reason you probably discovered it on the internet and because of growth we've had, has largely been because of Ron Paul. In his presidential campaign, he was an Austrian. He brought a lot more people to be looking at this school of thought. Because it's interesting, even though it is the Austrian school, it's largely an American-based, or at least has been a very American-based school of thought, because Louis von Mises, who, the Mises Institute where I work for, he had to flee as a Jewish economist, a Jewish free market economist, and Hitler didn't like any of those three words.
Right.
He had to flee Europe during World War II to America, and from there, along with a student of his, F.A. Hayek, that wrote Road to Serfdom, he also came to the U.S. shortly thereafter. So most Austrian economists were trained in Europe or trained in America ever since World War II. Though now that's actually kind of growing. There's a growing international movement. We've got scholars that reach out to the Mises Institute from all around the world. There's a lot in Brazil in particular that's really exciting. So, it's this growing international movement because what people are seeing is that the way that we understand economics is flawed. This is how we get the financial crisis. This is how we get a lot of the craziness that's out there. So when people are looking for new answers, the Austrian school comes in and has different approaches to things. There's a kind of long rambling answer. There's a lot to kind of pack in there, but that's kind of some of the highlights.
Well, it's how you said it. This is American-based type of thinking, and I realized that reading it, but then it had like the Austrian school.
Yes.
I was like, wait a minute, that's American. You can't, you can't take our that. But there was a lot of similar principles. Definitely anti-central economy minded, but what you just said really perked my attention. It's not based on money or modeling or predictions. It looks more at human actions.
Yes.
Now, explain that more, because I'm not sure. I want to make sure everybody catches that.
Sure.
That's a very important element.
So the way that we see that economics is kind of a universal science. So it applies if you're what's his name? Tom Hanks stranded on an island with a volleyball, right?
Right.
Economics applies, right? You have a scarce amount of time throughout the day. You have to decide: do you consume berries, or do you spend your time investing in the production of a spear? Right, the spear becomes a capital good. All this sort of so it applies at a one man on an island level. It also applies in a global economy. Do you decide to consume your income? Do you decide to save your income? If you want to make big purchases, you need to save. So that this time preference is a very important concept, and I think it's if economics could ever have like the same sort of popularity as like self-help books, my pitch would be like, instead of chicken soup for the soul, it'd be time preference for the soul. Because what time preference really is simply saying that understanding that saving your desire, not just being gluttonous, every single day, being able to save over time. That is the key to civilization. It's the key to a stable existence. Every time you save, it helps in you have any sort of uncertainty down the road. And what's really scary is that, who really hates savings? It's central banks. It is a lot of the zeitgeist that has infected economics since the 1930s through what was called the Keynesian revolution. John Maynard Keynes completely reformatted economics in a very, very bad way because he saw savings as diminishing economic activity, right? If you take money out of the system, you put it in your bank account, you put it in your mattress, whatever, you're diminishing what is actually going on in the marketplace. And he saw that as a bad thing. And so he thought governments, especially in times of economic crises, should discourage saving. That's exactly the opposite thing. Saving is security for the future. And so what we have right now, for example, is that we've had no interest, zero interest rates, very slightly above that since the financial crisis. So we have been encouraging as much spending as possible. We've been encouraging asset inflation, like stock markets, right? If you're not getting any money saving, you're going to put your money in the stock market. That's going to raise stock market valuations more than you would without this intervention. So that creates bubbles. And bubbles are here. You can make a lot of money in a bubble. And if you get out of these assets that are in a bubble before it busts, you can do very well.
Right.
But when you create more bubbles, you create a more fragile economy. You create a more unstable economy. And so that's some of the things where it comes to, if you understand the importance of time preference and savings on an individual level, it applies in this larger level. And then you see the way that modern governments and modern tools can make larger these kind of core issues in ways that are very dangerous. And so as Austrians, we're typically very skeptical of big Fed interventions. In fact, we would prefer for there to be no Fed at all, that all these decisions can be better placed on the market. We're very skeptical of fiat government controlled currency, right? There's a lot of Austrians that are very big about saving in gold, crypto, Bitcoin. In fact, Bitcoin itself was inspired by the Austrian School of Economics as a way of kind of creating a modern gold standard. If you read like some of the original papers there, he was very inspired by F.A. Hayek, and it's almost certain that he read some of this stuff through the Mises Institute website, which is kind of cool. And so again, it's skeptical of government intervention in the money. It's also skeptical of government regulation because there's limits to what regulations have unforeseen consequences because it is a third person trying to interfere with individual acting in the marketplace. And so if you're looking for a school of economic thought that provides the greatest critiques on interventionist government policies, the Austrian school is really where it's at, which is why you saw a lot more interest in the Austrian school with kind of the Tea Party revolution on the Republican side early on. Because again, we had, I know Glenn Beck used to be selling F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom nonstop, and he was an Austrian economist as well. So that was another reason that we became prominent again, is that when people are looking for reasons against pushing back on government interference, we have the strongest arguments out there.
And the whole thing with human actions is they're not very predictable. Right. I mean, they kind of are,
right?
But then they're not. So it's like every time the government makes a decision, we're going to tax this or extend this or raise this or provide this. They think it fixes whatever problem, but then they don't foresee the human reaction to that, which causes 3 more problems to pop up in its place, right?
Yep. And it's one of the issues that haunts economics is that you have some people that are very free market, for like Milton Friedman sort of school of economic thought. Mm-hmm. They have a view that kind of sees that, okay, well, human beings always try to maximize their profit, right?
Yeah.
They're very, and the issue is that like, that's really not how human beings act. Like we're not necessarily always consciously trying to figure out what the most we act in ways that we think are going to have the best outcome, but we don't have, it is a more, it's not necessarily always the most rational view, right? It's just simply what we think is the most rational view. So again, like, so somebody out there making bad decisions, they're making bad decisions because they think they're going to be good decisions, but they don't turn out right. Right. And this happens throughout. And so yes, exactly. Individuals, human beings, we have different reactions to different environments from a person to person basis. And so having the humility, like I think what the key of economics really is highlighting how the humility with which that we can go about understanding government systems and things like that, because there are limits to what we can do. I think it was an F.A. Hayek quote that the curious case of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they know about what they imagine they can design. And so again, in your head, you can always think of all these great plans and schemes and all that. Economics kind of puts a lens on there that makes you have to question all of your assumptions and to really think about whether you're utilizing your time and your assets in the most efficient means possible.
Yeah, so I can definitely understand that. But with the human actions, though,
yes.
How then is the Austrian School of Economics? And I ask this because I'm interested in economics, but I've never been, trained in it or gone in great depth. But if there was to be, say, a empirical science, if you will, how do you how do you use this philosophy in understanding the unpredictability of human actions, but know how to study that, knowing it's unpredictable?
Well, that's kind of it. So with the way that Austrians look at economics, we see that there's economic science, which is logic-based and it's deductive, and it comes from our understanding of how human beings act, because we're all human beings, right? So it's a very limited in its scope, really. And so from that, again, we all know we have subjective value. We all know that we make decisions on the margin. By that, it means if you have, like the reason why water is worth less than diamonds is because there's so much more water out there that diamonds are more scarce, right? So we make decisions on the margins. There's opportunity costs and everything we do. Like it's a very kind of humble sort of view on what economics can teach you. Then you have economic history, which is applying this economic lens to history. And what Austrians understand is that you cannot simply assume that historical episodes are going to repeat perfectly. So what we do not say is that, you can simply look at what happened between 1930 and 1940, deduct whatever the best policies from that period were, apply them today, boom, you're going to have the same sort of thing. We are actually we have a very humble view in what you can get, what you can actually learn from the past. So we are very what Austrians tend to do more than other economists is limit our predictions about the future. This can sometimes be frustrating because people are always wanting, like you talk about booms and busts and how that there can be financial crises and things. Okay, well, when is that bust going to happen? When is that bust going to happen? The answer is we don't really know. There's all sorts of policy things that government can do to kind of keep a bubble going. There's things that it can do to trigger a bubble popping sooner rather than later. So in terms of predicting what is going to happen next, economics itself as a science properly understood doesn't really tell you that. It tells you how to understand the present. What that really, that forward-looking skill, what that really is entrepreneurship. And one of the exciting things is there's a lot of entrepreneurship programs out there. The Austrian understanding of the economy is becoming more and more prevalent out there because we understand that it is precisely that role of the entrepreneur that is willing to invest capital, predicting on a view of the future that they think they can profit on. That is what actually moves society forward. That is what actually produces the real goods and services that improves our lives. That's the risk-taking procedure. It's not economics telling you that. It is your understanding of the world and your willingness to take on risk as an entrepreneur that ends up actually creating the future that we're going to end up inheriting from these great people. So again, rather than a lot of other economists that would say, "Oh, we can predict this sort of thing," and if we simply put in this policy, we say like, no, that there's limitations to what we can understand about the future. And then we try to, so we try to keep as many resources in the hands of entrepreneurs rather than government decision makers to give them as many options as possible to building that future that we're going to be able to enjoy.
And I guess that then is a good summary as to why the view of the Austrian economics is to have less government interference and more empowerment of the individual, right?
Yes, that's a big reason for it. Because again, the decisions that you can make when you have actual skin in the game is so much better than what a bureaucrat can make. And one of the Nassim Taleb is an economist that's written some very popular books, and he's kind of very inspired by Austrians as well. And so like he's made this point a lot about the importance of skin in the game, because it's amazing how many important decisions are made in the world today by bureaucrats and very protected offices that really do not feel the consequences of their own decisions. Exactly.
Wow, you're right. And with that, I now want to talk about a different theory with you. It seems to be gaining steam just the same. The modern monetary theory. Yes. Have you heard of that?
Oh, yes.
I wow. I've been looking into that and some of the things it advocates, and I'm just absolutely terrified that people think this is a great idea.
Well, the thing with MMT is there used to be the old joke that about the Federal Reserve, that's not federal, it's not a reserve. And well, in this case, I mean, there's nothing modern about MMT. It's really not about monetary theory at all.
Right.
For the longest time, there's always been this view that government by its own fiat can create as much money as you need.
Right.
And that's just simply not true. But the thing is that for all, this is really crazy stuff, but we have to recognize that we are effectively living in an MMT world. The Federal Reserve, the ECB, the way that the major central banks, China in particular, China's a whole nother show, but the way that these central banks operate and have operated for decades is effectively with an MMT mindset that the only limitations of that the only thing they worry about is kind of inflationary concerns, which they can deal with taxes. That they can print as much goods as they need. It's very, very scary. And what we're seeing, and unfortunately, I think COVID has only expanded on it. Is I mean, the amount of intervention, money production that we've seen in the last year is something of scale that we still have not fully. The consequences of the COVID era and the public policy response, both in the U.S. and internationally, we have still not even come close to really dealing with the full consequences, because they are effectively believing that they can produce as much money as possible with very little consequences as long as the government has the taxing authority. This is also why there's a really big push right now to eliminate cash from society, because central banks. If you eliminate cash is kind of the one last beacon that we have as consumers against central banks. You can take cash out of your bank account, you can store it under your mattress. If they try to impose negative interest rates, whatever they want, if they want to track your purchases, they can't do it.
Right.
This is all connected because a cashless society is a society where the central bank has as much powerful as possible. And MMT is a philosophy that believes that the central bank should be the most powerful government actor in this regard, using the money printing ability. So these two go hand in hand, and they're both very, very scary. And unfortunately, it's a world that we're currently living in.
I mean, you were talking about history not being a good judge of whether something works or not in the future. I mean, I don't know if I fully agree with that.
Well, it's they're not the same.
Right. But because I look at this example with the government making as much money as it wants. And in my, I don't, like I said, I don't have this deep education and research to me, but with what I know, I think of the American Continental, I think of the Confederacy dollar,
Right.
I think of the Weimar Republic mark.
Right.
I think of the government interference of the Great Depression, which extended it far longer than any depression in our history. And I'm thinking, historically speaking, this is not a good idea.
But the great thing is that it's also theoretically speaking, because again, what we're talking about there is the production of what's called kind of fiduciary media, right? Like the medium that's for the purposes of exchange.
Mm-hmm.
When you expand that artificially, then just the same way that if you were to build a house, right, and the size of that inch constantly changes based on what the government wants, you're not going to build a good house, right? And you don't really need to know that the history of like kind of that sort of thing to understand that if you simply don't have a benchmark that is stable, it's very difficult to do things. And so again, history tends to play out the what works bad in theory tends to show up throughout history. Only that history cannot necessarily create new theory. That is kind of what the difference is there.
Okay, gotcha.
Because there's so many variables that you can't independently measure. So you're absolutely correct. The history of this is terrible. Now, the reason why you're going to have people that say, "Oh, well, it's different right now," is kind of a few different folds. One is that America is the global reserve currency, so because of that, we have a lot of power. And so I'm not encouraging like your audience to go out there and start like just trading in all your dollars for gold because we're about to see a hyperinflation. No, like there's a lot of wiggle room. Like it's not going to happen just like that. Because what's happening in the U.S. and what's been happening in the U.S. in the last 10 years is that the Fed has had zero interest rates and have created a lot of money out of thin air, right? Bad.
Right.
But Europe's done even worse. They've got negative interest rates. They've created even more relative to their economy. China is a complete just mess. They've had the largest, everyone's concerned about, like, and this has been true on, like, you talk to people on the left and the right, they're convinced like China's smarter than we are. No. But what China's been doing is that the last 10 years, you've had the largest period of credit expansion with that. So that's why they're building cities out of, for people that don't live there. Right. Just craziness. Right. China is the new Soviet Union in the same way that the Soviet Union fell because of its own economic policies. But so China's been doing crazy stuff. Bank of Japan's been doing crazy stuff. Even Bank of Switzerland. I mean, having a Swiss bank account used to be like the safest of safe. Swiss has been doing crazy things. So because you have a global kind of pandemic of crazy, really bad monetary policy, America relative to the rest of the world looks okay. And so because we've been the least bad, how long that stays, we've been really, really bad the last few months. How long that stays is going to be another question. But I think what's going to end up seeing play out is that since you have all these other countries that have embraced this similar style MMT thing, if you are, if you're Argentina and you try to do MMT, which they kind of have in their own way, like there's like Argentina's had like two really, really bad, and they're about to go in a third really bad currency issue because of embracing this sort of policy. Their currency fails, right? They don't have the same support that America has. I think you're going to end up seeing smaller currencies start feeling the strain from embracing this sort of MMT, proto-MMT sort of philosophy. And it's going to be like a domino effect where it's smaller currencies start failing, put strain on larger currencies, and then put strain on the dollar. But it is interesting, though, how that MMT philosophy that you've brought up has been so massively popular amongst government bureaucrats around the world, because at the end of the day, the people that really benefit the most from MMT is government policymakers. Right. And it's the same way that the Keynesian revolution that was really big about pushing government spending and new public projects, that was really popular with government officials because it justified them doing more. So unfortunately, we too often see that the ideas that win out in government are not what's true or false. It is what better justifies the actions of those in power.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you really like Rage of the Age, we will encourage you to leave a review on the platform that you're listening to, but especially if you would like a copy of my book, Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire, which is a first-hand account of my second deployment to Iraq, and it's filled with many spiritual insights. I'm going to give away 10 copies for free. And every week I will give out a copy for someone who leaves a review of this podcast. You can do that by going to Twitter, write your review, and then hashtag it Rage of the Age Now. Or you can go to Facebook, find our page, Rage of the Age, click the reviews, recommend us, and then write in your review. I hope next week to give away a copy of Not in the Wind, Earthquake, or Fire to someone who leaves a review.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
Unfortunately, that's why Austrian school has never been particularly popular with the government.
Well, I imagine so, because the very idea is the government can claim we came in and saved the day, whether it did or not, whether there's consequences or not. That's somebody else's problem down the road. They just come in, boom, we fix this, hailed as a hero, get voted in another term, keep all your buddies in the bureaucracies in business. I can definitely see the draw to this type of policy, because it gives them the illusion that they can control the economy down to every detail almost.
Yep. And what's terrifying is that the way this is playing out within the education system. I mean, again, I went basic public schooling. You're told that FDR saved us from the Great Depression.
Right.
No, FDR's policies gave us the Great Depression.
Yeah.
If you look at the 1920s had a similar market crash. You had a very hands-off philosophy, and it recovered very quickly. Nobody talks about the Great Depression of 1920. They talk, they talk about the 1929, 30s. But the government, but that's the problem, is that when the education system is also controlled by the government, then once again they promote the narratives that best promote the government, which ends up creating the bureaucrats that believe these ideas that best promote the government. So we get an ever-growing government.
Yeah, I've recently had Lawrence W. Reed as a guest on the show, talking about the myths of the Great Depression.
Yes.
And I got educated some, because again, the education provided to me by our, dear old government made it sound like FDR rescued us and saved us. And, but he was, I don't know. When that comes out, that's definitely going to be an eye opener for many people when that episode airs. But I definitely see what you're saying there with the Great Depression. The things that were taught, can I say it? They're lies. Yes. I mean, they're flat out lying. And I don't know if either they know it or they're just that naive. And I don't know which it is. And if they know it, that's just evil,
Yeah. Well, the problem is that a lot of historians do not have any sort of background in economics. Mm-hmm. Most historians, if they read any economists at all, they read Karl Marx.
Right.
There's a guy named Thaddeus Russell. He has a podcast, and he got his PhD at Columbia in history, and he says the only economist I ever read was Karl Marx, and it's absolutely terrifying. Right. Because economics and history go hand in hand. You cannot understand historical episodes without understanding the economics.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so one of the best historians out there is a guy named Tom Woods. He wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History. Bob Murphy, who's another, and both of these are scholars with the Institute. Bob Murphy wrote The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression. But both of them have done a lot of very important works looking at history from that perspective. Because again, once you start understanding economics, then it allows you to go back and debunk so much of what you're told in schools. And it's like having a superpower. It's it's a very nerdy superpower. It's not very good. It's not quite as I don't think that you could, if you fly, you could probably have a better luck at picking up women at a bar with it than economics. But
that's true. But, unless you make money with it.
Yes, very true.
Well, I love history far more than economics. Though economics, intrigues me. I consider myself an amateur historian simply because I don't get paid for it. But when I look at history, I see the economics too. That baffles me, your statement that historians don't really view the economy of things, because to me, they're so interwoven into things that happen.
Oh, And it's like, I mean, you read, like, for example, like, and again, I don't think that it's sinister. I think it's more out of ignorance. But like, I mean, you read a biography about Alexander Hamilton, and they're going to tell you that Alexander Hamilton was the father of American capitalism. Well, no, I mean, Hamilton rejected Adam Smith. He rejected a free market view. What he wanted to do was to resurrect a mercantilist style of economy,
right?
With high tariffs, with high internal protections, with subsidization of industry.
Very British.
And I don't fault him for it, right? Because here you have it's 1780s. He's looking around. What's the most powerful country in the world? It's Great Britain. Why wouldn't we want to be like them, right? You have all this free market theory that's going out there, but like, that's just theory. I don't want to test that. We need to be like Great Britain. That's fine. Luckily, his idea when the Federalists fell out of power, you had one of the most underappreciated people in American history. Is a guy named Albert Gallatin. He was Jefferson's Treasury Secretary. Also served under Madison. He was awesome. Like he was another immigrant, just like Hamilton. He was Swiss rather than from the Caribbean. But like he came in there, like started slashing government projects, like that Jeffersonian style of economics. Like Jefferson had some weird views on economics. Like he's got like a French Jacobin at heart. But the Gallatin actually added that kind of the economic know-how that you really needed for that Federalist Party, or the Republican Party, that anti-Federalist mindset to really succeed. But again, he's not recognized, right? Like he's just kind of glossed over. Whereas they make Hamilton of Wall Street the embodiment of capitalism, and so it's natural for people today to see Wall Street as the embodiment of capitalism. But like Wall Street is one of the biggest benefactors of government intervention, which is not exactly what capitalism tells you that you should do. Again, it's all baked down. It's all sorts of levels, and it's not. Again, I don't think it's some sinister conspiracy. It's just a shame that there's so much ignorance about what economic science is, and it infiltrates in the way that so much of what we're told out there.
Well, especially in the public education sector, where they only kind of push one view of economics as if others don't exist.
Oh yeah.
Yes. The some of the other things that I've come across that MMT has as concepts, and you can steer me if I'm misunderstanding this, but well, you've already mentioned that deficit spending is what builds the government spend what it wants, but the ideas I've seen is that this helps builds this specifically is what builds people's savings, not people saving it, but if the government shoves out the money, that builds their savings. Is that a viable concept?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of this ends up it disconnects paper money, money circulating in an economy with the production of real goods and services. And it's like, you don't eat money. You don't live in money. I mean,
especially digital money.
I take a lot of paper mache where if you had a lot of bills laying around. And so that's the issue, is that what they're focused on is the way that money circulates in the system. And in this case, it could even be like with a UBI sort of thing. You could circulate into some real goods and services. And it's that's a disconnect that they don't see. And that's the issue, is that, that's why we need to be producing. We need to be saving. We need to, saving up for larger capital goods. And that is the disconnect. So again, it is again, this view of money has been around for a very long time. It never ends up going well, and unfortunately, it is a very good way of getting in positions of power where those that want to justify their exorbitant spending like to bring you in as a witness to make them feel better about themselves.
Yes, there's also the idea that small deficits and surplus in the national debt can actually cause a recession. What do you think about that?
Well, see, what they're looking at is, it's true that if you have what they're focused on is traditional GDP numbers, which include government spending as part of that formula. So what Austrians, and this is one, again, there's all sorts of great little quirks that Austrians have that I love. And one of them is that we reject GDP as a really good measure of national spending. In fact, Murray Rothbard is one of he was one of the founders of the Mises Institute, one of the great scholars in our tradition. I think his measurement that not only would he withdraw government spending, but then he would subtract it again, because of the consequence of government spending was even worse than, you're actually getting less bang for your buck than a buck is. And And so that's what they're looking at, is that if you decrease government spending, then your GDP levels might trigger a recession from a GDP standpoint, because again, you're lowering the amount of government spending within that equation. The other side of it is that it's absolutely true that if you have certain industries that are dependent upon government spending, then cutting those could also trigger recession. Like one of the things that I'm very worried about within kind of the American economy is that, one of the great industries, one of the strong points has been the fracking revolution. Well, a lot of fracking depends upon, like, it's an industry, and this is the case with a lot of kind of early industry things. So they're relying upon, it's a very debt heavy industry right now. Wow. Particularly with gas prices as low as they are, right? I mean, that doesn't help. Low gas prices are not bad. It's just not good for this particular industry. Right. And so they've been rarely reliant upon these low interest rates. Well, if you increase interest rates, and we're not going to in the very near future, the Fed's made that very clear. If you increase interest rates, it makes it hard for some industries that are very debt reliant. This is also true of a lot of big tech industries. You have a lot of, I think Uber still isn't profitable. And so if you have an increase in interest rates, then you're going to have a strain on these very debt sensitive industries. And so that can cause some disruption. But what that shows is that the real market prices of debt, if don't validate the some of these businesses that are out there, that's in a true free market capitalist system, you have creative destruction, right? And some businesses are going to fail, some industries are going to fail. What you have, though, is right now is governments don't want anything to fail. Right. And particularly, this is the really scary thing. We've mentioned in the past already that low interest rates means that more people are pumping money in the stock market, right?
Yes.
Okay, so everyone's relying upon stock markets. It's not only just people with 401ks. If you have an insurance fund, if you have pension fund, and you're getting nothing from government debt that's a very conservative, safe asset, then you're going to have to make up for it by getting into say stocks to get your yields up, right? So you're now purchasing stocks. Well, considering the amount of stocks out there that are these very debt-heavy companies, when you start allowing those companies to fail, again, like Uber is a major company, very, very heavy on Netflix, very heavy on debt. Right. If Netflix fails, think of the consequences. Not simply, streaming services going offline. It is the amount of systemic risk built in with as many people buying up Netflix stock as possible. The ramifications of that create a much larger crisis because we've pumped so many people in this more volatile stock market. And so now that's what ends up creating the justification for, we need to protect Netflix. So then now we need to spend government money to protect the bailouts. Netflix. Yeah. Yes. And so there's all sorts of ways that, when you incentivize the spreading out of this risk, it ends up creating a lot of bad moral hazard within government decision making, which can open up all sorts of problems. And some of that, I think, in a minor way, gets to some of the stuff that MMT is getting at. I think more often than not, they're really talking about the GDP aspect and the way that government spending is factored in. But again, all of this together just shows that the amount of the current economy is so perverted by government interventions at all different levels, fiscal, monetary, regulatory, etc., that we've created this very fragile system. And unfortunately, it's a very centralized system, right? In a world, in a time right now, everything has become decentralized. Knowledge is decentralized. Everyone has it on their phone.
Yes.
This should be a period of decentralization. And yet, the more the federal government does, the more the economy is dictated upon the policy of a very small handful of people, and that's a very scary thing. And again, it's counterintuitive to the age that we're living in.
Yes, and I guess the intriguing question that I have now, what would be the Austrian school's recommendation to fix
this? Yeah.
the current American? Because, like you said, there's it's almost like a powder keg that no one wants to light, but it's almost like it has to be lit. I mean, unless I'm missing the.
No, yeah, that's pretty much this is what we get to deal with. There's a few different levels to this. One, in terms of kind of pragmatic approaches that wouldn't kind of spark the apocalypse. I think one of the best things, and the Republicans try to do this with the Graham Kennedy bill in healthcare, is that so we've got all these government programs that are federally centralized, right? Well, if you break them up and you put them at the state level and you let states manage them, I think that, again, we talk about, I just talked about centralization there. The more that we can decentralize the policies and the programs that so many people have become to rely on, I think better off we're going to be. Now, you're going to always have issues like where you have people saying, oh, I paid Social Security and I've lived in 3 different states. How do you deal with that? Well, there's ways of working around all of that with that specific program. But in terms of like the actual services, if we had, if we simply block granted out Medicare and Medicaid and we let states deal with it, I think you're going to end up finding a lot more solutions there. We could also, in terms of this, one thing is we're never going to pay off the government debt. It's never going to happen. So we're going to end up defaulting. And this has happened before. It happened in the 1800s. It happened in 1970s when America went off the gold standard, which kind of really is, if we want to look at what is the prologue to all the craziness that we have now, I think was that final decoupling from gold under Nixon. And you can actually look, there's a website, I think it's called like WTF happened in 1971. That's all these great charts about like income inequality and the financialization of the economy, all these sort of really bad things that the left likes to talk about.
Yes.
They happened in 1971. They don't try to figure out why. They don't try to go down the federal. So that's a big issue there. One of the ways of kind of, so we're going to default just like we did in 1971. That's probably going to come from like a revaluation of the dollar at the best case scenario, which is another reason why like it's a good idea, in my opinion, to diversify your portfolio with gold, cryptocurrency. Real estate is a real asset, right? So they can't inflate that away. Things that you can't inflate away, those are good things to hold just as an individual measurement there. But you're going to have some sort of currency reset, and whether that comes from a devalued dollar, whether that comes from the IMF coming in and trying to kind of bail out all the currencies. Because again, as I mentioned before, you're going to have it's not just going to be the US having this problem. It's going to be the euro. It's going to be the yuan. It's going to be the yen. It's going to be international currencies around the world having these issues. Interestingly enough, the one currency out there, the one central bank that's like really, really strong in terms of its debt to gold is Russia, which is just odd. But so everyone else is going to have a problem. So the IMF may come in and try to do like a one world currency sort of thing, which makes a lot of sense from a global technocrat sort of idea.
Yes.
I don't want that at all, but it makes sense from their perspective. And I think what's going to end up happening is that this massive I think you see this global populist uprising and Trump and Brexit and et cetera.
Right.
I think that the next big battlefield is going to be this interesting populist push between Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and gold holders versus the technocrats trying to install some sort of kind of tighten the control of central banks and government fiat money. Because what the system that we have right now, it's like, as I mentioned, like there's no way of not having some sort of major shock. You're going to have a financial crisis. Right. There's going to be a major financial crisis because we never took care of 2008. We've got so many bubbles now. The stock market bubble is so much wider than it's ever been before because of its infiltration in pension funds and insurance funds and everything else. You've got a major bubble in government debt, major bubble in student loans, major bubble, and et cetera. Like, there's going to be a major physical reset. It's like we don't know the timing of it, but there's no way of dealing with this stuff without some sort of reevaluation of the way things are. And what comes next is going to be a very interesting battle. But again, it's just like you could have, if you look at government spending leading up to 1971 and that reset, like there's a lot of people kind of saying, look, like, this is not going to last much longer. And then you have that breaking the gold window. I think that's one of the important roles that the Austrians play now, because again, we're the ones looking at it from that perspective. And so just trying to say, look, like, the Fed can say all they want that they're in charge and that they know how things are going to go.
Right.
They've proven time and time again that all of their predictions about how they're going to normalize in 2008 were wrong. Right. Like if you look back and you listen to like the 60 minutes, they were wrong about the way that things were going to go during this decade. They're going to be wrong again the next decade. They don't know how to unwind this stuff. And so the more that we can protect ourselves on an individual level by holding things that aren't government controlled, the better off we're going to be. But the more that we can decentralize, again, go back to your question, the more that we can decentralize these programs, I think can help create make it a lot stronger than the current system we have. I'd be fully in favor of selling off a lot of the government land, because like we're looking at assets that need to go. Like that's one way of doing it. There's a lot of land out there that we can and it's just more that we can get assets outside of the control of government, more in the hands of entrepreneurs and non-government Americans. I think the better off we're going to be. But it is a very, it's a very difficult situation. And it's made only the more dangerous by how radical the left has become in their desires for public policy at a national level. Right. Which is why, again, if my viewpoint right now, what I've been telling my libertarian friends is that, the best way to plan for the future is vote for Trump in November, buy gold and Bitcoin in the short term, and hope that the left doesn't take power during a financial crisis, because the lengths that I think that they're willing to go now, how radical a lot of the decision makers in the Democratic Party have gone, is very, very scary. And a financial crisis can only embolden some of the worst passions among us.
So it's been a really great conversation with you today on so many things. I don't have the time for the sake of the show. I could probably talk for hours about this. I think this is a very interesting topic of and how we're facing it. The things you're saying are like in our soul American, but what the actuality, the reality of how the economy is running is not. And that, to me, that's frightening, because it takes away our character. And it's like a multiple set of bubbles just waiting to explode. But it was great talking with you today, and I appreciate you being with us.
Well, thank you. If anyone out there has any questions, I'm always happy. My email is tho@mises.org. You can find me on Twitter @Tho Bishop. And if you're interested in learning basic economics, we have a new website with videos that we just launched called begineconomics.com. This is begineconomics.com. And they'll kind of go on some of the basics that I mentioned at the beginning of the show.
I want to take a quick opportunity to give a shout out to two podcasts that I want to recommend that you listen to. The first one, of course, is the Gary Wilkerson podcast, which is a podcast of the guest that you're listening to today for today's program. The Gary Wilkerson podcast, you can find it at worldchallenge.org, and he's currently doing a series on the attributes of God. I highly recommend that you go there and listen to it yourself. I also want to highlight for you Veterans Rant, Rattle, and Roll, with the emphasis on stopping the average of 22 suicides that take place on a daily basis. And the whole aspect of the show is to have veterans come on, rant, rattle, and roll, and talk about their lives and everything that's going on. And of course, to emphasize to others to not take your own life. Again, the Gary Wilkerson podcast and the Veterans Rant, Rattle, and Roll.
You're listening to Rage of the Age. Rage of the Age. Politics, religion, economics, and history with a conservative bend.
For this essay segment, I want to start off by just talking about something simple in economics called the business cycles. Because it's around this that part of our discussion was taking place during this episode between the various theories, mainly the Austrian view and the current popular modern monetary economic thing, the MMT, that we had been discussing in this during this episode. And the business cycles, and I learned this going through school. I'm very curious if they even bother to teach this anymore, because it seems like to have just simply disappeared from the thought of the national conscience. But the basic principles of the business cycles go something like this. You have a point where you have businesses in the economy and whatnot. It prospers, it grows, it's booming is another term that would be used. And then there's a certain point where the market adjusts and there's some curbing that goes on. And then you have a recline where it takes you into a recession. And then from that recession, you go into a depression. And then from a depression, it goes into an upturn again where there's a recovery. And then you go back into, a prosperous economy where it's booming. And this repeats itself, all of it depending upon, how the economy ebbs and flows with each other and how things interrelate. The idea, though, that is being presented is that the government, in its infinite wisdom, can somehow intervene and prevent the bad parts of this business cycle and keep us forever in some realm of prosperity, and thus solve this cycle that's, has been quite scary since the Great Depression. Now, if you haven't heard the episode with Lawrence W. Reed, please go back and find that one, where we talked about the myths of the Great Depression, where the Great Depression was made great because of government interference and because of government control of the economy. Yet the theory still seems to persist that somehow the government has the wisdom and foresight to somehow manage an economy single-handedly and prevent bad things from happening. And this idea has really taken hold in a nation that's supposed to be home of the free and home of the brave. Most people, when something happens, nowadays are very prone to say, somebody should do something about that. Well, who? Eventually who it's going to be. It's going to be the government. And they're going to want them to come in with a heavy fist and force things a certain way and make this outcome come out. And in the end, they create more problems than what they fix. But they'll take credit for it nonetheless. And then someone else gets mad and says, well, someone should come in and do something for my problem. And next thing you know, we want government to fix everything. Let me remind people again who are listening, and we forget this. We are governed by the people, but we act like the government does everything for us. The government is supposed to help facilitate, and we are meant to run things in our own lives as much as possible. The government is meant to facilitate. By no means was the government ever meant to run everything directly and intervene at every possible moment. Now, we've talked about this idea of the fiat income and just basically the idea that we can print as much money as we want. If we need money, we'll just make more. We'll never run out. So if I want to spin off the hook, it doesn't matter. We will always have money. And when I grown up, we kind of knew that was a stupid idea. And when I was in, again, school at that time, they taught history. And in our history lessons, I definitely recall that the American Continentals suffered from that problem. Massive inflation because we printed as much as we wanted. And the next thing you know, there's Continentals everywhere. They're worthless. They actually passed laws that if you don't take it as payment, that was viewed as treason. Why would nobody take it? Because it was worthless. They would rather have actual metal. You look at the Confederate dollar, they suffered from the same idea. We'll just print as many dollars as we need. It became worthless. It wasn't based on anything of real value. The Weimar Republic, after the First World War, that's in Germany, for those that don't know. Their inflation was absolutely ridiculous. We're talking like millions of marks to buy a loaf of bread. And they would just keep printing it like it was no big problem. And it was absolutely horrendous. It was those types of activities which helped spiral Germany into a depression and other nations into a depression. And the way the American government handled its Great Depression, the whole world was suffering. And what did that lead to? People like Adolf Hitler, people like Mussolini. And then, of course, well, you have Stalin. He's already pushing his thing from the other end anyway, causing chaos. But we have plenty of examples of why this is a ridiculous idea. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. I'm baffled that there are people, PhDs, that because they can fudge the math and make it look right, that think this is a great idea. I'm absolutely just confounded. Absolutely. All we are doing is prolonging bubbles. And we talked about bubbles in this episode. Prolonging bubbles. It just keeps getting worse and worse, but all we're doing is delaying the pain. That's really what it is. No one wants nothing to fail. We want to look like we're marching in to save the day. We want believe the illusion that we can actually control economic interaction. And what they're missing is that means social interaction, how people interact with each other. The government's trying to control that because that's a very key part of the economy. Well, it don't work. It only delays the inevitable. When we do break, it's going to really, really hurt. And we're not going to have a backup for it. It's sort of like when you take drugs for pain in your body. You need a surgery to fix something, but you don't want to do the surgery. So you just take these drugs to numb the pain and move on. You feel the pain again, you shoot some more drugs in, and you keep on going. You feel the pain, you keep shooting drugs. You see where I'm going with this. Eventually, you're going to have to cash in and face what you've been failing to deal with the whole time. That by the time they maybe go in to do the work for the surgery, you might have caused far worse damage than if you just had it taken care of the first time. That's sort of what these economic policies look like. Just keep shooting it up with drugs, keep the economy rolling, but eventually it's going to break because it's not allowed to naturally adjust itself as would be normal in a freer economy. It's sort of like giving drugs to the rock star. You've probably seen this in movies. You've heard this illustration and you understand it. You know, the rock star, the music star today, they just keep, the show must go on, keep pumping them full of drugs. And then you go out and sing and they're like a zombie. They come back and pass out and they get to the next, hey, the show's on again. It's time to get up and do another show. And they shoot them up full of heroin and something. Hey, you got to get out there. You got to keep it going. You got to keep it going. But eventually there's a breaking point. Isn't there? Of course there is. There's always a breaking point. Things have to adjust, and that includes economies. Economies have everything to do with how people interact with each other, the values they place upon things, and how much they want of something, what service they want. But if you have the government telling you what to have, not have, and it wants to prolong the suffering of something that should just crash anyway, it doesn't seem like a good idea. In the short term, yeah. And that's the problem is everyone is doing a quick fix. They get the credit for it, but then they push the problem down the road because it's good. They know it's going to break on somebody. They just don't want it to break on their watch, right? It's sort of, that's how it is. It's very dishonest. And I'll go on record that I'm just as frustrated with conservatives and Republicans in this regard as I am the Democrats. I expect the Democrats, I expect the far left wing to act in this fashion. That's their thing. They love big government. They love to control every aspect of society and tell you what to do from that one little point called Washington, D.C. But when I see conservatives and Republicans doing this very same thing, that really frustrates me. They'll say things like, we're for small government. We want to rein in the spending. But do we see it? Never. Do they ever cut it? No. Do they work to reduce our spending and to reduce the budget and to, not borrow so much? No. It just keeps on going. They will bail out just as much as their arch enemies. They will use big government to accomplish something and to inflate something and to prolong something, to keep the market going and to keep this industry from failing. And you know why? Because they have stakes in it too. They have stakes in it too. That's why. It has nothing to do with what's best for the country. It's all personal protection. So I'm as frustrated with, I would call people that supposedly on my side in this regard, but when it comes time to vote, they don't do it when they get in the big chair. This is what's frustrating is we've gotten to a point where we are accepting these monetary policies as normal, but we're ignoring the dangers that are coming. And we have plenty of people with, different little mathematical tricks just because the government's a part of the GDP, showing that if the government's not a part, it'll crash the mathematical formula. Well, yeah, because it's a big chunk of it. Of course it will. We have to apply more logic, like Tho Bishop has said. And we need to understand that economics is not something you can control down to the last detail because you're going to have people react in ways that are going to alter the conclusion you wanted. Now, I want you to consider this. Do this since we're all into virtual things and not real goods and services, but hey, if it looks good on paper, then it must be true, right? So make up a fake business, okay? Just make it up, dream up a grand one. The bigger the better, because I want you to notice if they see something that's possibly big that they can, marry with you on, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And, I want to start this business. I want to build this factory. It don't even have to be true. Just for a test. Just a test. Go to your government officials and see what
what permits you need. See what licensing fees you're going to have. See what inspections you're going to have to endure. See which politicians you have to, quote unquote, buy off, right, to make it happen. Who do you have to appease to make it happen? Where are some of the things you're not going to want to have to do because they're protecting their buddy's business over here, whatever it is, right? And just see what you have to go through just to open that business. Not to mention the potential taxes you're going to face and all the issues with the employees you're going to have to hire, et cetera, et cetera. All the strings attached. You know how it used to be in this nation? I want to open a shop. Open a shop. There it is. If you're good, you'll succeed. If not, you just won't last long, right? If you want to open a factory, go open a factory. You want to build ships, build ships. The market provided it and corrected it naturally and allowed it to flourish and grow. But now we're at a point in our economy where people won't start businesses unless they get a grant. And who is the primary player in that game? The government. So now we're dependent upon the government to spur new entrepreneurs into action. Everything is convoluted. Everything is distorted now because the government is so intertwined in economic activity, like to every deepest part, to where people won't even start their own business. And I don't see that as good. I'll probably do some more of these economic episodes to look into these principles of economics because it's obvious the government-controlled schools are going to push the ones that are easily controlled by the government. Surprise. I know. But you know what? I believe in the empowerment of the individual, that the government is meant to provide for the common welfare, to set the stage and the conditions where private individuals can prosper on their own, not by the permission or the necessary help of a big government.
You've been listening to Rage of the Age. If you loved today's podcast, make sure to leave a review on the media you're listening through. Secure future episodes by heading over to rageoftheage.com and clicking the RSS feed button. Until next time, this has been Rage of the Age.